Welcome back to Boss Economics World, folks. The channel where we rip apart the economic madness, expose government blunders, and show you how the suits in power are tanking your wallet, your future, and, let's be honest, your sanity. I'm your host, the guy who's allergic to bad policy and terrible economic excuses. Buckle up, because today, we're diving headfirst into the chaotic circus of global monetary policy, trade wars, and central bank flip-flops that are pushing us all closer to an economic dumpster fire. Let's roll. Oh, ladies and gentlemen, what a week it's been. In a mere 24 hours, we've witnessed not one, not two, but three interest rate cuts from European central banks, Switzerland, Sweden, and Norway, all scrambling like headless chickens to dodge the fallout of Donald Trump's trade policy roller coaster. And let me tell you, if you think this is just a random blip, you're in for a rude awakening. This is a neon-flashing, siren-blaring symptom of a global economy teetering on the edge of a cliff, and guess who's steering the ship? Yep, the same central bankers and government policymakers who got us into this mess in the first place. So, grab your coffee, or something stronger, because today, we're peeling back the layers of this economic onion, from the surface-level chaos to the rotten core of mismanagement, bad policy, and outright incompetence. And trust me, by the end of this, you'll see why Boss Economics World is your go-to source for calling out the clowns running the circus. Let's start with the headlines. Just this week, June 16th to June 22nd, 2025, central banks controlling over 40% of the global economy were scheduled to make policy decisions. And boy, did Europe deliver the drama. The Swiss National Bank, SNB, slashed borrowing costs by 25 basis points, Sweden's Riksbank did the same, and Norway's central bank shocked everyone with a quarter-point cut that not a single economist surveyed by Bloomberg saw coming. Talk about flying blind. Meanwhile, the big dogs, the US Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, and the Bank of England, sat on their hands, twiddling their thumbs, while smaller players like Pakistan, Turkey, and Chile followed suit. Now, if you're thinking, hey, maybe these rate cuts are a good thing, cheap money, right? Hold your horses, because this isn't your grandma's rate cut to boost the economy. This is a desperate, last-ditch effort to put out fires that central banks and governments have been pouring gasoline on for years. And what's the spark? Oh, just the looming threat of Trump's trade tariffs, set to hit as early as July 9, 2025, combined with the geopolitical powder keg of the Ukraine war and whispers of a potential US strike on Iran. In other words, it's a perfect storm of uncertainty, and our so-called expert policymakers are running around like they've never seen a storm before. So, why are Switzerland, Sweden, and Norway slashing rates like they're in a Black Friday discount frenzy? The official excuse is inflation, or rather, the lack thereof. But let's break this down, boss economic style, and see what's really going on. First up, Switzerland. The Swiss National Bank claims it's cutting rates because consumer prices fell by 0.1% year-over-year in May 2025, and their shiny new forecasts predict inflation will average a measly 0.2% for the entire year. Why? Because the Swiss franc, that safe haven darling, has been appreciating against the dollar and euro ever since Trump took office. A stronger franc means cheaper imports, which sounds great, until you realize it's crushing Swiss exporters and dragging inflation into the gutter. But here's the kicker, the SNB isn't some innocent bystander here. For years, they've been playing currency games, trying to keep the franc weak to prop up exports. And now, with Trump's trade policies throwing a wrench into global markets, the franc is surging, and the SNB is panicking. They're even flirting with negative interest rates again, yep, that insane policy where you pay to keep your money in the bank. Brilliant, right? Just brilliant. Next, Sweden. The Riksbank says it's cutting rates because price pressures have eased after a temporary spike earlier this year, and the Swedish economy's so-called rebound has fizzled out. Oh, and let's not forget their krona, which has been the best-performing currency in the G10, surging 15% against the dollar in 2025. That's great for keeping imported inflation in check, but it's also a double-edged sword, making Swedish exports more expensive and slowing down the economy. Now, here's where Boss Economics World calls BS. The Riksbank has been flip-flopping like a fish out of water, claiming just 3 months ago that they were done loosening policy. And now, here they are, cutting rates for the 7th time since the pandemic. 7 times. If that's not a sign of cluelessness, I don't know what is. And Governor Eric the Dean even had the audacity to say, hey, we might cut again. Gee, thanks for the confidence, Eric. Maybe try figuring out a long-term plan instead of treating monetary policy like a yo-yo. Finally, Norway. Unlike Switzerland and Sweden, Norway's inflation has been stickier, with core consumer price growth hitting 2.8% in May 2025, still above the central bank's target but down from earlier highs. The Norges Bank now predicts headline inflation will drop to 2.2% in 2026, down from their March forecast of 2.7%. Sounds like progress, right? Wrong. This rate cut, their first since the pandemic, reeks of desperation, especially since the Norwegian krone has been weaker, making imports more expensive and keeping inflation elevated. So, why cut rates now? Because Norway's policymakers are spooked by the global trade chaos and the risk of a slowdown. But here's the real question: if inflation is still above target, why are they loosening policy? It's almost like they're admitting they have no clue how to balance growth and price stability. Classic central bank incompetence. Now, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, because these rate cuts are just the tip of the iceberg. The real story here is how years of terrible government policies and central bank cowardice have left the global economy vulnerable to shocks like Trump's trade tariffs and geopolitical flare-ups. First, let's talk about Trump's trade policies. The man's back in office, and he's wasting no time threatening punitive tariffs on countries across the globe, with a deadline of July 9, 2025, looming large. Now, tariffs sound tough, right? Make America great again. Sure, but here's the reality: tariffs are a tax on consumers, you and me, and they disrupt global supply chains, jack up prices, and slow down growth. Just look at the last round of Trump tariffs in 2018 to 2019. According to a 2023 study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, those tariffs cost U.S. consumers an extra $40 billion a year and wiped out 142,000 jobs. And now, with the global economy already on shaky ground, Trump's bringing back the tariff hammer. Genius move, right? But wait, it gets worse. Governments and central banks have spent the past decade kicking the can down the road, refusing to address structural problems like stagnant productivity, rising inequality, and over-reliance on debt. Take Europe, for example. The Eurozone's GDP growth has been anemic, averaging just 1.2% annually from 2010 to 2024, according to Eurostat. Meanwhile, public debt levels have soared, with countries like Italy sitting on debt-to-GDP ratios of over 140%. And what have central banks done? They've kept interest rates at rock-bottom levels, flooding the system with cheap money, inflating asset bubbles, and doing nothing to fix the real economy. And don't even get me started on the U.S. Federal Reserve. The Fed's been sitting on its hands, refusing to cut rates despite mounting evidence of a slowdown. Why? Because they're terrified of reigniting inflation, which hit a 40-year high of 9.1% in June 2022 before cooling to 2.6% in May 2025, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But here's the problem: by staying paralyzed, the Fed is letting the global economy spiral into chaos, forcing smaller central banks like Switzerland, Sweden, and Norway to pick up the slack. It's a classic case of too little, too late. Now, let's hit you with some cold, hard facts, because at Boss Economics World, we don't just rant, we back it up. The global economy is flashing red warning signs, and the data is screaming recession. First, global trade volumes are tanking. According to the World Trade Organization, global merchandise trade growth slowed to just 0.8% in 2024, and they're predicting a further decline to 0.5% in 2025 if Trump's tariffs go through. That's a disaster for export-driven economies like Switzerland, Sweden, and Germany, which saw its industrial production drop by 3.9% year-over-year in April 2025, according to Distatus. Second, consumer confidence is in the gutter. The University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index in the U.S. fell to 66.4 in June 2025, down from 69.1 in May, signaling that Americans are bracing for tougher times. In Europe, the Eurozone Consumer Confidence Index dropped to 14.3 in May 2025, its lowest level since mid-2023, per the European Commission. Third, business investment is drying up. The Institute for Supply Management's manufacturing PMI in the U.S. fell to 48.7 in May 2025, signaling contraction, while the Eurozone PMI dropped to 47.3, its weakest reading in 6 months. When businesses stop investing, jobs disappear, and growth grinds to a halt. And finally, let's talk about debt. Global debt levels hit a record $307 trillion in 2024, according to the Institute of International Finance, with emerging markets particularly vulnerable to rising interest rates and currency shocks. If central banks keep cutting rates to prop up growth, they're just pouring more fuel on the debt fire. But if they don't, we're looking at a wave of defaults and a full-blown financial crisis. Damned if you do, damned if you don't, thanks, policymakers. So, here we are, folks. Central banks are panicking, governments are clueless, and the global economy is a house of cards waiting to collapse. And who's to blame? The same people who've been asleep at the wheel for years, central bankers who think cheap money solves everything, and politicians who prioritize short-term optics over long-term stability. Here at Boss Economics World, we're not afraid to say it: this is a recession in the making, and it's not just bad luck, it's bad policy. Trump's tariffs are the spark, but the kindling has been piling up for years, thanks to government mismanagement and central bank cowardice. And who's going to pay the price? You, me, and every hardworking person trying to make ends meet while the suits in power pat themselves on the back for doing their best. But hey, don't take my word for it, look at the data, follow the trends, and ask yourself, do you trust these clowns to fix this mess? Because I sure don't. That's all for today's episode of Boss Economics World, folks. If you're as fed up as I am with this economic circus, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and ring the bell to join the rebellion against bad policy and worse excuses. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think we're headed for a recession, or is this just another bump in the road? Until next time, stay sharp, stay skeptical, and remember, the only boss you can trust is Boss Economics World. See ya.